All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something pretty interesting. It's kind of like, could this tiny trace mineral actually be like a secret weapon for our health?
I'm Chelsea, and I'm a nutrition expert. I'm really excited to be here to break down this essential nutrient with you all.
Awesome to have you on the show. And of course, a big shout out to everyone listening from the Detox Health YouTube channel. If you're into learning more about, how to improve your well-being, definitely go check out their channel and hit that subscribe button. They're the reason we're able to bring you this deep dive today. And hey, if you're finding this conversation helpful, feel free to share it with anyone you think might benefit, friends, family, whoever.
So the tiny trace mineral we're diving into today is selenium. It's like one of those nutrients that doesn't always get the spotlight. But we've got some really cool research here that shows why it's so important. We're going to be unpacking all the science-backed benefits, and we'll also look at what happens if you don't get enough selenium, or even what happens if you get too much.
Yeah, for sure. So our main goal today is to give you a clear understanding of why selenium matters, in a way that's engaging and easy to grasp. We'll be highlighting all the key takeaways that you can actually apply to your life without getting bogged down in all the technical stuff. So Chelsea, let's jump right in. Both of our sources make it clear that selenium is an essential mineral. What does that actually mean when it comes to our health?
So when we say a nutrient is essential, it means our bodies can't make it themselves. We have to get it from our diet. And selenium is one of those. We only need it in super small amounts, hence that whole trace mineral thing. But even though it's tiny, it plays a really big role, especially when it comes to our metabolism and how our thyroid gland functions. It's kind of like, a small part that's totally crucial for the whole engine to run smoothly.
Gotcha. Metabolism and thyroid function. Those are definitely pretty important. One of the things that I always hear about selenium is its antioxidant power. Can you unpack that a bit and explain why it matters so much?
Totally. Okay, so imagine your body is always producing a bit of internal exhaust. That's what we call free radicals. They're just a natural byproduct of things like metabolism. And in small amounts, they're not a bad thing. They can even be helpful, like in fighting off infections. The trouble starts when we have way too many of them, and things like smoking, drinking too much alcohol, or being stressed out all the time can really increase that production. And this imbalance leads to oxidative stress, which can basically damage our healthy cells. Selenium is a key ingredient in those powerful antioxidant enzymes like glutathione peroxidase. Think of these enzymes as specialized cleanup crews that neutralize those harmful free radicals and protect our cells from damage.
So selenium is kind of like backup for our body's natural defenses, especially when we're dealing with a lot of stress from our environment. And I remember reading that this type of cell damage from too many free radicals is linked to some pretty serious health problems down the road, right? Like heart disease and Alzheimer's, things like that.
You got it. Oxidative stress is a factor in a bunch of chronic conditions: heart disease, different types of cancer, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, even premature aging, and an increased risk of stroke. So by helping to neutralize those extra free radicals, selenium plays a big role in protecting us from that damage.
Okay, that makes total sense. Let's switch gears for a second and talk about cancer. There's always a lot of talk about selenium and its potential to help prevent cancer. What do our sources have to say about this?
What really stands out here is this huge review of 69 different studies, and the
Wow.
results were pretty clear. People who had higher levels of selenium in their blood, specifically from their diet, had a much lower risk of developing certain types of cancer. We're talking about breast cancer, lung cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, some major ones.
That's pretty significant. And it's really interesting that they specifically linked it to selenium from food, not just from supplements. The review attributed those benefits to the different ways selenium works, reducing DNA damage and oxidative stress, which we already touched on, but also boosting the immune system and even directly stopping the growth of cancer cells.
Exactly. And there's even some early research showing that taking selenium supplements could actually be helpful for people going through radiation therapy. For example, there was one study where women who were being treated for cervical and uterine cancer reported a better quality of life and less diarrhea when they were taking selenium. So that suggests that selenium might be able to help reduce some of the side effects of cancer treatment. Of course, we need more research to be sure, but it's a promising area.
Yeah, it sounds like selenium's role in cancer is pretty complex and potentially really beneficial. Okay, let's move on to heart health. It looks like selenium might be a bit of a guardian for our cardiovascular system, too. How does that work?
Well, if you think about what causes heart disease, it often comes down to inflammation and oxidative stress. And that's where selenium's benefits become really clear. Studies have found a connection between low selenium levels and an increased risk of heart disease. And when they looked at 25 different studies, they found that higher blood selenium levels were linked to a lower risk. One of the main ways selenium might protect our hearts is by lowering the levels of something called C-reactive protein, CRP. CRP is basically a marker for inflammation in the body, and it's usually higher in people who are at risk for heart disease.
So by reducing inflammation, selenium could be helping to keep our hearts healthy.
Absolutely. And selenium also plays a crucial role in making glutathione peroxidase, that super powerful antioxidant enzyme we talked about earlier. So by tackling both inflammation and oxidative damage, selenium could help prevent atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of plaque in the arteries. And that's a big deal because atherosclerosis is a major cause of heart attacks and strokes.
It's amazing how all these different systems in our body are connected and how one nutrient can have so many effects. Let's talk about the brain now. Our sources mention selenium's role in mental health and cognitive function, especially when it comes to things like Alzheimer's. What's the link there?
This brings up a really interesting question about the role of oxidative stress in our brain health. There's a growing belief that oxidative damage plays a big part in how neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's develop and get worse. And it's interesting because a lot of studies have found that people with Alzheimer's tend to have lower levels of selenium in their blood.
And it's not just about having low levels, right? I think I read somewhere that antioxidants might actually have a positive impact on memory in people with Alzheimer's.
That's right. Some research suggests that antioxidants, whether they come from our diet or from supplements, might be able to improve cognitive function in people with Alzheimer's. There was even this one small study, but it was a good one, that found eating just one Brazil nut a day, which are packed with selenium, actually improved verbal fluency and other measures of cognitive function in people with mild cognitive impairment. Plus, there's the Mediterranean diet, which is full of selenium from foods like seafood and nuts. And that diet has been linked to a lower risk of Alzheimer's.
That's pretty fascinating. Makes you wonder if even slight selenium deficiencies could be playing a role in how our brains age.
That's a great point. One of our sources even suggests that selenium deficiencies that aren't super obvious, where you don't have clear symptoms, might still be contributing to these diseases and could make things worse for people with conditions like HIV, which can affect cognitive function too. There's also a study that focused on older adults and found a strong connection between low selenium levels in their blood and both senility and a more rapid decline in cognitive function.
Wow. It really seems like selenium is essential for keeping our brains healthy throughout our entire lives. Okay, let's talk about another important area, the thyroid. I know selenium is super important for our thyroid gland. Why is that?
It's interesting. The thyroid gland actually has the highest concentration of selenium compared to any other organ in the body. Just that fact alone tells us that it's got to be important there. Selenium basically plays two major roles in thyroid health. First, it acts as a protector, shielding the thyroid gland from oxidative damage, which is a constant threat because the thyroid is always working so hard. And second, selenium is absolutely essential for our bodies to make those active thyroid hormones. And those hormones, like we said before, are what regulate our metabolism, our energy levels, and how we grow and develop overall.
So what happens when we don't get enough selenium for our thyroid to function properly?
Well, selenium deficiency has been linked to a higher risk of various thyroid problems. One of the big ones is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's an autoimmune disease where the immune system basically attacks the thyroid gland by mistake. And that leads to hypothyroidism, which means an underactive thyroid. There was one study that looked at a bunch of people, and they found a clear link between low selenium levels in the blood and an increased risk of both autoimmune thyroiditis and hypothyroidism.
Interesting. And is there any research looking at whether selenium supplements could help people who already have thyroid problems?
There is, and it's pretty promising, especially for people with Hashimoto's. A review of a few different studies found that when people took selenium supplements every day for about 3 months, it actually significantly lowered their levels of thyroid antibodies. Those antibodies are a key sign of autoimmune thyroiditis. And what's really interesting is that the people in these studies also said they felt better overall, both in terms of their mood and well-being. But we do need more research to figure out the best dose and what the long-term effects of taking selenium supplements for thyroid issues are. And it's definitely something you should always talk to your doctor about before trying. One of the sources even brought up this concern that the average selenium intake in Europe might actually be too low, which could mess with healthy thyroid hormone metabolism. So it's all about finding the right balance.
It really emphasizes the importance of getting enough selenium but also not going overboard. Okay, let's shift focus to the immune system. Our sources all agree that selenium is a major player in keeping our immune response strong. How does it actually help our body's defenses?
Selenium supports our immune system in a few key ways. First, being a powerful antioxidant, it helps reduce that oxidative stress, which then helps regulate inflammation. And inflammation is super important for how our immune system works. Also, research has shown that having higher levels of selenium in your blood actually means you have a stronger and more effective immune response. On the flip side, when you don't have enough selenium, it can actually weaken your immune cells, which makes you more likely to get infections, and it slows down how quickly your body can fight them off.
So it's like selenium is making sure our immune cells are ready to go when we need them.
Exactly, and you can really see how important selenium is for our immune system when you look at certain viral infections. For example, not having enough selenium has been linked to a higher risk of dying from HIV and the disease progressing more quickly. But when people with HIV took selenium supplements, they actually had some benefits like fewer hospital stays and better overall health. And there's evidence suggesting that selenium supplements might help our immune system fight off other infections too, like the flu, tuberculosis, and hepatitis C. One of our sources even specifically says that when you're deficient in selenium, you basically lose immunocompetence because selenium is actually found in our immune tissues. And when you get enough selenium, it can have what they call immunostimulant effects, which means it strengthens the immune system. It's even considered a key nutrient for fighting back against how viruses develop and stopping HIV from progressing to AIDS.
That's incredible. So much impact from one little trace mineral. I also noticed that asthma was mentioned in our sources. Is there a chance that selenium could be helpful for managing asthma too?
That's a good question, and it's an area where we're still learning a lot. Asthma involves a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation in the airways. And because we know that selenium is really good at fighting inflammation, it makes sense to think that it could help reduce some of those asthma symptoms. Studies have shown that people with asthma tend to have lower selenium levels in their blood. And in one study, they found that asthmatic patients who had higher selenium levels actually had better lung function. There's even some early evidence that taking selenium supplements might mean some people with asthma need to take fewer corticosteroid medications. But we definitely need more research to be sure about those findings and to come up with clear recommendations.
It does sound like a promising area for future research, though.
Yeah.
What about selenium in reproduction? Our sources touch on that a bit too. What have researchers found about its role there?
Well, for a long time, selenium has been considered essential for successful reproduction, especially based on animal studies. In veterinary medicine, they found a link between selenium deficiency and miscarriages that they can't explain. And giving selenium supplements actually helped prevent early pregnancy loss in animals like sheep. In one human study, they found that women who had miscarriages had lower levels of selenium in their blood. Plus, selenium is really important for how well sperm can move, which is obviously key for male fertility.
So it looks like getting enough selenium is important for both men and women when it comes to reproductive health. Our sources also suggest a connection between selenium and mood. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, selenium seems to play a pretty significant role in brain function, which of course affects our mood. When our body's selenium levels are low, the brain actually gets priority when it comes to getting selenium, which tells us it's super important for brain processes. Studies have shown that when you're deficient in selenium, it can mess up the balance of certain neurotransmitters in your brain. Those neurotransmitters are basically chemical messengers that directly affect how we feel emotionally. Some studies have even found that selenium supplements can help reduce how often and how severe intractable epileptic seizures are in children. Other trials have suggested that not having enough selenium might contribute to feeling down or having a bad mood, and in some cases, taking selenium actually made people feel better. And remember that link we talked about earlier between low selenium and senility and faster cognitive decline in older adults. That also underscores how important selenium is for our brains and how it can indirectly affect our mood.
Wow, it's really amazing how many potential benefits are tied to this one trace mineral. So for our listeners who want to make sure they're getting enough selenium, what are some good sources they can include in their diet?
Luckily, there are a bunch of delicious and healthy foods that are good sources of selenium. Oysters are a great source. Brazil nuts are another good one. And then there's halibut, yellowfin tuna, eggs, sardines, sunflower seeds, chicken breast, and shiitake mushrooms. Just keep in mind that how much selenium is in plant-based foods can vary depending on how much selenium was in the soil where they were grown. Brazil nuts are a good example. They can have wildly different selenium levels depending on where they came from. That's why it's always best to mix things up and eat a variety of selenium-rich foods. That way, you're more likely to be getting enough.
Makes sense. Variety is key. Now, we've talked a lot about the importance of getting enough selenium, but our sources also warn about getting too much. What are the potential dangers of going overboard on selenium?
That's a really important point. Even though selenium is essential, it's crucial to remember that it can become toxic if you get too much. And if you get really high levels, it can even be fatal. The recommended daily intake for adults is about 55 micrograms, and the upper limit, the most you should be getting, is 400 micrograms per day. You're more likely to run into problems with selenium toxicity from taking high-dose supplements than from just eating food, although you could get too much if you eat a ton of Brazil nuts regularly. Some signs of selenium toxicity are hair loss, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, facial flushing, tremors, and muscle soreness. And if you get really severe acute toxicity, it can cause serious problems with your gut and your nervous system. It could even lead to a heart attack, kidney failure, or death. So, like with most things in life, moderation is key. Stick to those recommended intake levels.
That's a good reminder that more isn't always better, especially when it comes to supplements. Now, I saw something in our sources about selenium intake levels around the world. Are there certain areas where people might be more likely to be deficient in selenium?
Yes, and it's a big concern for public health. In many parts of Europe, people tend to get less selenium than in the United States. That's mostly because the soil in those areas has less selenium. Our sources suggest that the current selenium intake levels in various parts of the world, like the UK, parts of Europe, China, New Zealand, and maybe even some areas in the US, might not be enough for people to be as healthy as possible and to lower their risk of disease.
So that's something to be aware of. It's a pretty widespread issue. Lastly, our sources mention an interesting interaction between selenium and certain toxic metals. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Selenium can actually bind to some heavy metals like mercury and potentially make them less toxic. Therefore, completely inactive. For example, the mercury you find in some types of seafood is often bound to selenium, and that might offer some protection against mercury poisoning. But this binding process could also make a bit less of the selenium from those foods available for our bodies to use. It's a complex interaction, and researchers are still trying to figure out exactly how it all works.
Wow, that's a really interesting thing to consider when we're thinking about what we eat. Okay, Chelsea, before we wrap up, let's quickly recap the key takeaways for our listeners.
You got it. We covered how selenium is a powerful antioxidant and how it might protect us against some cancers and heart disease. It's crucial for keeping our brains healthy and for our thyroid glands to work properly. And we talked about how important it is for a strong immune system and how it might even be helpful for managing asthma. The best way to make sure you're getting enough selenium is to eat a variety of those selenium-rich foods that we talked about.
Right, and don't forget, getting too much selenium, especially from supplements, can be risky. It's important to stick to those recommended daily limits to stay safe and avoid any negative side effects. And if you're enjoying this deep dive on selenium, don't forget to subscribe to the Detox Healthy YouTube channel for more awesome health info just like this. Okay, here's one last thing to think about. We've learned that the amount of selenium in food can change a lot depending on where it's grown and the quality of the soil. So how do we make sense of nutrient density? How much nutrition we're actually getting from our food in a world where our food system is so global? What does this mean for the choices we make about what we eat and for public health recommendations that are trying to make sure everyone gets enough selenium? It's definitely something worth considering. Chelsea, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us today. This was a great conversation.
Of course, I enjoyed it.
And thanks to all you listening for joining us on this deep dive into the amazing world of selenium. If you want to learn more about important health topics, make sure you subscribe to Detox Health on YouTube. Until next time, take care.